Now we got to watch out what we say. Gosh, I hope somebody comes.
Looks like numbers are rising.
Hello, welcome to our webinar today, Rebuilding the Workforce in the Museum. We have a distinguished panel of guests today to discuss the topics and the questions that I'll pose. I'd like to introduce our panel first. Joe Hastings is co-executive director at Explora in Albuquerque. Kirsten Ellenbogen, President and CEO at the Great Lakes Science Center. Beth Redmond Jones, Vice President of Exhibitions at Monterey Bay Aquarium. Ashley LaRose, CEO at Science North. Betsy Bradley, Director at the Mississippi Museum of Art in Jackson. Welcome to all of the panelists and welcome to everybody who is participating in the webinar today. The webinar is going to be recorded, and we do encourage you as well to put your questions in the chat. Later in the webinar, we will look at the chat questions and get to a few of those. So panelists, you will be able to chat with the participants as well as me today. And for those of you just joining us, welcome to the webinar. I'd like to start by just talking a little bit about our last webinar and where we are today. Just a little over a year ago, we held a webinar for a CEO and leadership webinar. And at that time, we were beginning to open our doors, welcome visitors back to our museums, and look with some optimism toward a post-pandemic future. We recognize that business as usual isn't going to return. We accept now that we live in an uncertain world. This is a world that military leaders in the 90s named a VUCA world. It's characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. COVID-19 disrupted museums in ways that we haven't seen in our lifetime. And in the midst of the pandemic here in the US, we witnessed the senseless killing of Black people by police. Our world changed, and constant change is our new reality. So our conversation today with our distinguished panelists is not all about doom and gloom. We not only survived that pandemic and those troubling times, we are recovering, on a path of recovering. In some cases, we're thriving. There are a lot of passion and energy among museum teams to become more agile and resilient in the face of whatever comes our way. So I'd like to start with a question and get right into the conversation. And Kirsten, I'd like to direct this one to you. As a response to the pandemic and the resulting closures and loss of revenue, many people lost their museum jobs. While some returned to employment in museums, many did not. Either they decided to look elsewhere or they were unable to find a museum job. What has changed about the museum worker in the post-pandemic world? Has the culture changed?
So, not to be doom and gloom, but the people who are no longer working in museums are people we need to be listening deeply to, right? These are smart people that our field have lost, who are unwilling to compromise on things that, in the 80s, I just thought, gosh, I'm so lucky to be working in a museum and would be willing to do anything to have that job. And people are a lot smarter than I was when I started in the field and expect more of their jobs, in part because the world in which we're living, and you talked about VUCA, and you can use a lot of different acronyms to describe the situation that some of our best and brightest are facing right now. But it's grim. It is different for housing. It's different when you're in the grocery store. It's different in transportation. There is a lot that our staff who should be coming up the ranks and being our future leaders are looking around and saying, I can't manage this schedule that has me here off and on some weekends because we have an event, or here late because there are donors here, or I can't manage this job with the pay, or I can't manage the distance I need to travel between affordable housing and the organization in which I want to work. There's a long list of ways that we have just got to be attentive to what the staff we've lost from the field need in order to ever hope we'll get them back.
Ashley, I wonder, have you experienced the same type of thing that Kirsten describes here in this kind of uncertain world we live in?
Sure. As the token Canadian representative, I'll be humble enough to say that I do not represent the entirety of the country, but I can represent the area that we serve here in Northern Ontario. And certainly I love, Kirsten, the point that you made about listening. These are smart people. Our organization faced a similar shift during the pandemic, some retirement and some realizing, this industry no longer serves the needs that I now have in the new reality post-pandemic. So certainly we are seeing the same thing north of the border as well. And it's really important to listen. What we have found is an importance of re-engaging to the meaning of the work that we're doing. We know our missions, we know our visions, but it's sometimes, this is a really good time to revisit that with our workforce. Let's get everyone back on the same page and reimagine what that vision is. Our vision is to serve. Our vision is to engage in science. There's never been a more important time. We saw that during the pandemic to educate and ensure science literacy. And so there's an energy in the air about reconnecting to our mission. And we found that to be a really powerful tool to re-engage our workforce.
Yeah, I've called on two people who lead science centers, and I'd like to turn the same question over to Betsy. You're in an art museum and not in Canada, in Mississippi. Do you have similar experiences, or are there some differences there?
We have very similar experiences in that the stresses of the pandemic caused us to reevaluate, readdress, listen, redevelop practices that would be more respectful of all of our colleagues and their living situations. I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned is that it's important for us to train ourselves and our colleagues on practices of reflection that will enable us to determine what pressures are caused by external factors that we can't control and which ones are caused in the workplace. And how do we respond to those in the workplace in a way that enables people to manage the external stress by having less stress in the workplace. And I agree that turning to mission and meaning is critical. We certainly found as we reopened our doors, and we weren't closed for very long at all, 6 weeks or so. But as we reopened our doors, people were flocking to just stand in front of a beautiful object. They needed this encounter with beauty, with other people who cared about such things. Even if they couldn't get too close to them, they could talk to each other. And I think that has continued to build an audience that knows that there are a lot of things outside of our control. These pressures are not going to stop, but we need to build lives that have meaning on multiple levels. And whether it's intellectual curiosity that is nurtured by a science center, or kind of a spiritual searching for what it means to be in the presence of beauty that an art museum serves. I think people are trying to hold on to those parts of their lives.
Hey, Barry, can I just add something? I think one of the other things too that we need to think about is, I mean, we lost a tremendous amount of staff. As Kirsten said, we've, a lot of people retired from the field, but we have a lot of younger people now coming into the field. So how do we as organizations and as a museum community train up these younger individuals to start taking leadership, managerial roles, and then leadership roles? And so I think it's really upon us to think about how we collectively as a community help support and grow this new community that's coming in, and try to get some of our old fellows back to join us either in that process or back in house if possible.
Well, Beth, thanks for bringing that up, because I think the way that we train staff or provide the culture building that they need to be an agile and resilient organization is really an important point here. But I've got kind of a hard hitting question, and I apologize for that because I'm going to throw it to you, Joe. Is that some have said that layoffs are a failure of management.
And you're asking me because
let me finish this question. What they suggest really is that leaders are not adequately preparing their organizations for disruptions, that they're not agile or resilient in this unpredictable world. So I just wondered, Joe, what do you think about that? What are you doing to make your organization more agile and resilient?
Yeah, and I mean, that is funny. Did you look up my statistics? We closed for 15 months. We had 120 employees. We went down to 15. We've built up, we're past, we're that size and bigger because people really are coming back in numbers that we didn't anticipate. Yeah, so I don't know if that was a failure on my part or a lack of foresight. It's tough to say, like if a tsunami hits, you do certain things to be ready, but at some point the wave's just too big. We now are more prepared for the next tsunami, I suppose. Looking back, I don't know, there's tough decisions that have to be made for the health of an organization. And you say, who's the organization? Is it the staff? Is it the board? And I would say it's the community and communities, plural. And so, whether we did the right thing looking back and going forward, some things I do differently, but I would do some things, I might not be here after the next emergency. Other staff might not be here, but this building, the stuff in it, the cultural, the gems, the jewels, if you will, in terms of what is culture here and important and should be protected and carried forward. There's got to be some core team to do that because it is all about people. What will we do different? I'll keep more money in the bank. That's for sure. In the past, when people said, "Oh, it's 90 days of cash," seemed like too much, or people not going to give us money because we got so much money. no one's asking that question anymore. Is there too much cash? And my partner, Kristen Lee, co-executive director, and I, culture. You all have said it. It's caring for the culture, caring for the people. But it doesn't mean that we wouldn't have to make drastic changes, including layoffs and others going forward, to protect the heart and soul and pass this forward to the next generation.
Well, I think we all plan for a bad budget year or that kind of thing. I don't think any of us ever planned for a global pandemic and what that would mean. And granted, I'm really glad to hear that some museums were only closed 6 weeks. We were closed 15 months, and we had to keep a full staff on because we have a living collection. So I think it's a really tough spot to be in. And I am talking with CEOs who have a bigger decision area of influence than I do, but I know that we were the vice presidents here at the aquarium. We were all part of that discussion about layoffs and how to manage that and how do we keep this from happening in the future. But
and I'd like to jump in and say that we've gone through several kinds of decision inflection points since 2020 and some really intense ones where I was pushed and pushed and pushed to say I would consider layoffs or eliminating positions, and I came close to losing my job over that. We did not lay anybody off. As I said before, we were closed for a shorter time than you all were. And we've had a great budget year and then a not so great budget year since. And I finally have, I think, convinced the decision makers on the board that we're not going to use payroll as a savings account anymore. It's not going to be the thing we have in our back pocket that we cut to make the budget work or to make the balance sheet work. There's got to be something else. And so I can't have a staff that's operating under the stress of, am I going to have a pay cut this year? Or am I going to lose my job? They're not going to be at their best selves at work if that stress is on them as they're trying to manage their homes and their families. So I think we need yet another culture shift in the business model of our organizations where we look for other ways to prepare, but not assume that it's going to be payroll.
That leads me to talk about other things besides the payroll that people were feeling even before the pandemic, but it was certainly heightened during the pandemic. We heard in Museum Expert over the past year some of the frustrations that people were feeling working in a museum environment. So let me ask Ashley, if you experienced this, that people reported to Museum Expert, and you probably have heard these things too, of feeling underappreciated, overworked. That's been brought up here, unheard and underpaid. How are you thinking about those and addressing all of those things?
Yes, certainly. Yes, that's a theme for us that we're hearing loud and clear from our staff. We're actually in the middle of a pretty major transformation throughout our organization, understanding post-pandemic that some of the structures that we had in place and processes just don't serve us anymore for how we're serving our visitors, and two, how we're serving each other. And so really listening to our entire workforce. So every person has had a chance to feed into this because we may have ideas of how to better serve our staff, but really they know what they need to be well served by their leadership. And so we're listening to them and making some changes from a structure perspective. What that also will allow us to do, and what we're really focusing on, is prioritizing. Pre-pandemic, with fully staffed, with lots of experience around the table, we could be really opportunistic. When something came our way, we could maneuver and we could deliver. we really have to be very critical and very objective in how we're prioritizing our activities right now. Because we're hearing the pressure that our workforce is feeling in terms of being overworked, how do we make sure that we are doing the right things at the right time and with the right people? And that's a shift for us. And so we've heard that that's landing really well. People are actually also coming up with really innovative ways that we can have the same impact, but in a different way that maybe is a little bit more easily adapted to the resources that we have at hand. So making sure that people are feeling connected to the work, prioritizing the work for maximum impact, and really listening to what is working and then making changes where it's not. Those are some of the ways that we're navigating that right now.
How about you, Kirsten? Did you you have similar thoughts? I think you're in mute.
I am. And I'm thinking, you know, it is everything from the, you know, listening, right? As Ashley's pointing out, it is absolutely also though, looking at your business model for the organization and saying, how does this look different if staff are positioned differently as a priority in the organization? So there are big shifts there as well and I'd certainly add that's been, you know, an important change through all of this and the ownership, right? So radical transparency. I saw a question asking about radical honesty. For us, I think it's been a little more radical transparency of it just being more open book about things and also providing a way for people to give feedback in a way that's anonymous, which can be pretty rough when you are in the receiving end of that. And people are allowed to be anonymous in their feedback, but give a voice to something that they're very uncomfortable bringing up otherwise. As well as then on the financial side of, you know, we've been talking about how do you prepare for the next pandemic or the next, you know, difficulty that the organization will face. And, you know, our staff get a full, you know, dive into our P&L on a monthly basis, which is more than the board gets. They get to see it quarterly, right? And staff having ownership over those numbers and seeing, you know, early in the pandemic, and we had the great benefit of, you know, we closed March 12th, we reopened June 1st for camps. We had Body Worlds booked to be open that summer, and we reopened just Body Worlds June 15th. And then we had the whole museum back open again, July 1st. And there were a lot of reasons we could do that, but that I'm not going to dive into here. But then when we got to 8 months into it, when we got to the new fiscal year, we did take a step back and say, well, clearly this is lasting. So what is our operating model? How are we staffing it? And that was the point in which we did do, you know, we laid off 13 staff at that point. And yes, 2 of them were from the executive team, but the rest were not. So, you know, and some of the questions that came up on like, well, you could just take a salary cut and cover everybody's salary, or, you know, and so we did exercises of like, okay, well, that's actually not a secret, right? And let's look at those numbers and let's sit down and look through some of this. Like, what are the real costs? Here is what we're spending on staff. Here's what we're spending on just heating and cooling the building, right? And giving staff a more power over really pushing on numbers and saying, why are we spending our money that way? Or, you know, why is the monthly, you know, expense coming out this way in that department and not this department? And it led to some very good questions. It led to some very awkward questions, but it led mostly to very good conversation. So we did not get through it all perfectly by any stretch of the imagination, but we've definitely kept a number of things we started, and that's helping us move forward. We just went today through the whole set of results on the staff survey, and, you know, we just keep learning.
Yeah. Does anybody else have anything to add to that about involving staff and understanding the business model and the finances of the organization? Anyone? Well, let me ask you this, Beth. Your institution suffered a big financial loss. I mean, you have a lot of revenue coming through the door at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and it was a significant loss. Could you talk a little bit about that, and then what you're doing in the staff to understand the impacts of this, and has it impacted your staffing as well?
Oh, yeah. Well, so pre-pandemic, we were over 600 employees, and with all the layoffs and everything, we went down to just over 200 or so. So we laid off almost 400 people, which was really awful and horrible. And so for us to stay, even though we weren't open, we still had to have our animal care team, our veterinary team, our controls team, our water quality team, our plumbers, our electricians. It takes a lot to run an aquarium. It was a little frustrating to hear other museums going, oh, well, we shut the doors and we're still getting laid off. And I'm like, yeah, we shut our doors, but we still have to keep all these people employed. So, we lost, over $50 million with the closure. And we are looking at a 5-year recovery because of that loss. And we're really trying to be thoughtful in what we're and the staff that we're bringing back and what are the positions. We've redone our entire HR job classification system. We've made levels now for every job position, from a level 1 to a level 5, and we've gone out and reclassified all of them. We've resalaried all of them. We've added a cost of living because Monterey is an expensive place to live, but we're still having a hard time recruiting people because people want to work hybrid. And for an exhibitions team, it's very difficult. I need a graphic designer on site at least 3 days a week. So we're trying to sort through these things and figure out what's the best way to move forward. Prior to the pandemic, our former CFO was often showing updates to the staff for what our financials were, kind of a very high level P&L. I think that we could do a better job in sharing that information out because a lot of people do not understand the amount of electricity that it takes. We have our own desal plant, so we run that to help for all of our, toilets and non-potable waters and that kind of thing. But it's a difficult thing to understand, like what it actually costs to run an aquarium. And it's not just your personnel costs, your non-personal costs, and your infrastructure costs. So I think the other thing that many museums are coming up against, I know we are, is we're aging. I mean, we're 40 years old. We live on the bay. We have 2 tides a day, king tides a couple times a year, and we're a concrete building. So it's starting to crumble. So then having to add all that in too, like you have to start balancing where's all of that. So we're right now in the process of, actually, as I speak, right outside the store is a huge group of cross-divisional individuals working together to talk about strategic planning. And we've dove in and we're looking at what is 2.0. What does our future look like? Where do we put our emphasis? We know we'll still work to conserve our one ocean, but how does that look like though for us as an organization?
Beth, you mentioned, you caught my attention with the remote workforce, and I wonder if anybody else has wrestled with this. Obviously, during the pandemic, we had a lot of people working remotely. How are you dealing with it today for people who don't have to be present in your science center or museum? Anybody want to jump in on that one? Joe,
Such a
remote worker?
Such a fun topic. And Barry, you're giving me all the good ones. Yeah, you pick on me because I'm such a curmudgeon and so old fashioned. Sure, I'd love to say everyone needs to be here all the time. We're pretty lucky. Most people want to be here a lot of the time, and that's great. But people have different needs. And I would say we were pretty decent ahead of the pandemic in thinking we have policies like everybody. We don't have rules, we have guidelines, and we kind of have more values and aspirations. we try to meet people where they are, and if they have special needs around family care or personal care or other things, even ahead of the pandemic, we would have worked with them to say, how can we make this work for you? And now we just have more of those conversations. And, and then there's the question is someone says, well, you're doing this for that person. And what about me? And so that's just more conversations. And we just have a lot of conversations. And, I'm not the most empathetic person here. Fortunately, I have a co-executive director who is, and we handle those kinds of HR. We don't have an head of HR per se. That's what we do in terms of engaging people and trying to build this culture of belonging. And so, yeah, it's tricky. And sometimes the conversations get a little bit difficult, but that's part of our job, right? As leaders, is to have difficult conversations.
I think one of the difficult conversations that we're having here is that there's a desire to have equity with who can be hybrid and who can be remote and who has to be on site, yet that can't be equitable. I can't have a plumber working remote. That just doesn't work. I can't have an aquarist feeding sea otters, from 5 miles away. So there is, I think our leadership team and managers need to get on the same page and understanding that equity has to happen within a division and not necessarily across an organization. And you have to figure out and you have to go to that leadership to understand what is right for your team and your organization as a whole.
Yeah, I know you're all thinking about equity and inclusion. Obviously, we weren't just dealing with a pandemic. We were also dealing with Black Lives Matter, with our staffs wanting us to pay more attention to issues that involve equity and inclusion. How are you thinking about that? What are some of the things that you're doing now? Kirsten, can I start that conversation with you?
Sure, as long as I can start the response with not enough, still not, doing lots and not enough. So again, one of the things that changed for us is just a lot more willingness across the board. So staff were eager to talk about equity, board eager to talk about equity, donors eager to talk about equity, and that was different, right? And so don't waste a crisis. It did allow us to put some equity conversations front and center in a way that was different than we had been able to before, which was terrific. So some of our grant writing got a lot more specific. Some of our programming got more focused, right? So those were certainly benefits that came out of those conversations. As an organization, we agreed that we're not going to have a diversity, equity, inclusion plan without having some meaningful actions behind it. So we have what we call action steps. And those are very specific goals we set for ourselves each year that fall under our DEAI plan, which we had years ago and didn't do much at all with, and updated it in a frankly more inclusive process. But the meaningful part of it is, here's the stuff we're doing now. And it is everything from changing where we spend our money. It is on equity and salary and some of the ways we run HR. It is equity in how we advertise things and, making sure that we are committing to finding ways to add in multiple languages more, which I know if you're, my California and New Mexico colleagues will probably roll their eyes at me, but here in Cleveland, that can be a bit of a radical step and that we are still behind on, but we're making great progress towards. So I think what's been helpful for us is just to give ourselves these milestones across all the different aspects of the organization, right? So everybody has to come together to say, what are the action steps we want to hit this year? We report, we check in, how are we doing on it? And there's accountability in the sense that it's a very, public reporting process. And on some things we say, yeah, that didn't go as far as it needed to, but here's where we are actually exceeding what we were trying to do. So progress, and we are again, just continuing to work. I mean, the staff survey I just referenced is another good example of just making sure we're looking for where those areas are that we need to make improvements.
So Betsy, do you have staff that are bringing issues up about equity and inclusion?
Yeah, well, always. I mean, you know, I'm in Mississippi where we say everything is about race and equity. Everything we talk about, everything we do, we question ourselves all the time. And we did start an initiative back in 2017 called the Center for Art and Public Exchange, CAPE, which is about bringing this lens of examination that is race and equity to our exhibitions, to our collections policy, to our programs, to artist engagement with community, to board training, staff training. We've done it at every level, and we were well on that path when we ran into the summer of 2020 and the killings of Black people, and of course, COVID. We do many of the things you're talking about, Kirsten. We do an equity report that goes out to our membership every year. We do staff surveys and we listen. We've rewritten, you know, job descriptions. We've had, you know, diversity and inclusion training of the staff on a regular basis, as well as the board. I think, you know, for me, it's about who has the power. And so, you know, I'm fortunate that we have an African-American board chair. We have, well, she just left, but we will have another person of color who is chief curator, who is guiding the artistic practice. We live in a city that's 82% African-American. So everything really is about race. And yet we're in an institution that for a long time a long part of its history was seen as a white institution. And so how we work with the community plays out on every level. I will say one more thing about equity, and that has come up in the chat too. There are a lot of questions in the chat about the board. And I really, one of the things that keeps me up at night is the board model that relates to the business model, which is that governance and financial sustainability are tied together, that we expect our board to be the fundraisers and the donors. And so they come to the table with money in their pockets and they're making the decisions. At least it's that way in the art museum world. It's probably more equitable in the science world, but in the art museum world, it's very much about people with money having those seats of power. And I think we've got to separate those somehow if we really are going to have an equitable institution. So that's one thing that keeps me up at night. The other thing is we are not through with these conversations about race and gender. You know, I was on a call with the Southeastern Art Museum directors and with the Association of Art Museum Directors in our country about laws that are being passed in Florida and Texas and Tennessee that restrict the rights of gay people, of trans people, of people who are anything but white men. And protests are happening. We had a protest because we have a partnership with the Gay Pride group. We had a protest at a public event. These things are going to continue to escalate until there's some dramatic change. But I think that's our next emergency is how we respond to these laws. In Florida, they're not allowed to discuss DEIA issues or to do DEIA training. What do you do? So those are some of my thoughts about race and equity.
Just to chime
Yeah.
in at the aquarium, where everyone goes through DEIA training. Every new person that's onboarded, it's a multi-day training. We've all had the same, so we're all on the same page. But one of the things that I really appreciate is that we've taken it a step further. Us group, we have a group around accessibility and mental health. We have a Latinx group, and these groups it's Chatham House rules. We have private conversations either in person or on Zoom. We have private Zoom channels when someone is struggling, or we're there to support one another. I'm part of the accessibility group, and it's been a way for people who are not necessarily working in the same divisions or on the same projects to come together in a much more, actually in a really meaningful and personal way. That has been, I have to say, it's been amazing for me to meet some people who are just have so much empathy and understanding for where I'm coming from with my personal challenges, and for me understanding theirs. And it's a whole nother level of support that I think has been really quite generous, I guess is the right word to say.
You know, Beth, thanks for bringing that up, because I'd like to, we have a lot of things to deal with as you're all discussing right now. I want to bring up one other one. Beth, you just mentioned it really, and that's about mental health. That this is really another pandemic. The Gallup organization in their worldwide survey say, well, specific to Americans, 1/3 of Americans are showing signs of anxiety and depression. And then worldwide, 7 out of 10 are showing signs. So the mental health is manifesting everywhere, and it's in our workplaces, has effect on our daily activities. And so how are you thinking about the mental health as a priority, the well-being of your staff, and mental health being right up there at the top of that? I'll add to this that the Gallup organization says in their surveying that career wellness, having a good job, is what people really want, and that is the first thing that's needed for mental health. But anybody have thoughts on that?
I can.
And I'm going to pick on people, like I say. Ashley, can I throw it to you?
Oh, Kirsten, you started to say something.
This is a great topic. We'd all have something to say. Yeah.
Like all ears. If anyone has the playbook, I've checked in my desk and I don't have one. So if you have the lucky playbook, please share. Certainly it's, though maybe the Canadian statistics aren't included in what you stated, I'm sure that they are exactly the same. It's an epidemic wherever we are. And it was on track to become an epidemic pre-pandemic. And so it, I think, certainly was exacerbated, and so here we are. And certainly one of the things that has helped is really creating a culture where it's okay to talk about it, and where we are, value is not the right word, but we are recognizing mental health on the same plane as physical health. And the same level of attention needs to be paid to it. So we have quite a number of supports within our organization that are available, both anonymous and within the groups, Beth, similar to what you've talked about, where there are people that have a safe place to discuss challenges that they're facing as well. And from a leadership perspective, we've made it very much known that we are considering the two equivalent, whether you have a physical ailment or a mental one where you need some support, they're valued the same. And so back to on maybe the more positive side, when we think about what a good job means, we need to understand what that means from our workforce. What does it mean to them to have a good job, for them to feel value and passion in the work that they're doing. And so, yes, that is a living wage. That is making sure that we're taking care of where we can their financial strain, but also how are we making sure that they have a balanced work-life balance, that elusive work-life balance as much as we can, and making sure again that they're connected to the mission. What are they getting out of working with us? And if there's more that we can do there, then what can we do? So making sure that it's part of the conversation and making sure we're understanding how we can make them feel connected and valued in their work is part of the cycle. But again, there's no perfect answer here. So I'd love to hear what my colleagues south of the border are up to.
I'll just say a couple of things we do here. I mean, yeah, such a big topic, so important. I've got 3 teenagers, 1 girl, so these things are often on my mind in a very personal way. But at Explora, we have a sensory chill hangout room for staff, so it's just a space people can use. We have fully paid healthcare for all employees, and that includes no copay visits to therapists. There's a bit of a healthcare crisis in New Mexico, so it takes time to get access to therapists, but that aside, it's there. And then we have a formal thinking about mental health program for teens. We're a children's museum and science center, but we're now also a teen center, and we're building a preschool. So cradle through career, teen seems to be where the crisis is at the moment here in New Mexico anyway. And so, paid staff with a focus on mental health.
So oh, go ahead, Betsy.
Well, I was just going to say that we're looking at it from both a community perspective as well as the staff perspective. I heard an expert on burnout talk, and it was interesting that she talked about work-life harmony and not work-life balance. There really isn't such thing as a work-life balance. And so if we can just create work where the values that are being practiced at work are the same ones people have at home and the same ones they have in their lives, I think it's creating that meaning in their work. That's what's come back from our staff surveys, is they feel like the work is meaningful. And I think that's really helpful. The other thing she said about burnout was we've got to stop acting like burnout is a problem of an employee, that they don't know how to take care of themselves. And we've got to stop talking about self-care. We've got to talk about burnout as an institutional issue, and how do we create practices that help eliminate burnout. The other things we do are work on mental health issues with our community. We have very popular art therapy programs for people with cancer, with Alzheimer's, but we're also doing a major exhibition of an artist exploring his great-grandfather's time in a lunatic asylum, which is what it was called at the time. And we're partnering with our medical center and a lot of the research that they're doing about mental health in our public programming for that. So it really is about, yes, it's about our internal community, but it's also about the external community and how can we be of service in that conversation.
Kirsten, did you want to add to that? We'll circle back to you here.
I've been taking notes. This is great and getting lots of good ideas. Only thing I'd add is I have appreciated moving the conversation out of a tight circle focused around HR, where HR would bring something to the attention of a supervisor, and then we'd have a code word or a system so that when someone needed a break or when someone needed an extra day and we'd have these singular systems worked out for staff who were able to really bring an issue forward. And instead now what we have is more, there's a wellness collaborative that is staff developed, staff led, organization funded. And so the conversation, like many others are bringing up, is broader, it's more inclusive, it's much more out in the open. And I, things I wouldn't have expected come up from the collaborative of what we want is let's get Headspace for everybody. Let's have a nice thing for all staff. It was great. It never would have occurred to me to get an all staff subscription to Headspace, but it's used, it's appreciated. And it was a great idea, you know, when you're looking for like, here are the institutional big things we're doing, and then what are those nice things that you add into that mix? And that has really come from this staff conversation that has been very helpful.
I want to change the subject rather dramatically here. I mean, we have something else to think about and worry about us at the same time. And that is, at least it's scaring me. An article I read this morning scared me a lot about AI, about artificial intelligence. How are you thinking about that? Is it in your mind right now, and how it's going to change your life, our lives? How are you dealing with it? Joe, I'll go back to you because you've got the new teen center and everything. Have you been thinking about AI? You're
Yeah,
gonna kill me, right, for throwing all these questions at you?
Yeah, I just went and watched Terminator again last night. I mean, you know, it's all out there. Yeah, you know, I guess it's funny, I don't embrace technology. Usually I'm not like the first one. I'm kind of in the second wave. There's some adoption model that's one of you all could quote, but at the same time, I'm not usually dismissive or fearful of most new technologies. I've played with this. I had it write a letter to my governor saying how she needed to contribute $5 million to our preschool based on statistics in New Mexico and so on and so forth. And, you know, it did a decent job. So, you know, those text generators, the big problem would be if people start listening to them, and if you don't know that it's not a person, and if we believe people more than robots or algorithms. No, I think so. I don't think it threatens our jobs at all. I think we'll be, in fact, better readers and better editors, and ultimately maybe better writers. I mean, writing is already going the way of cursive. I don't know about your communities, but it's just the written word isn't as valued as it used to be in certain formats, and that's too bad. And we can rail at it, or we can embrace technologies that'll help people express themselves more clearly. So, you know, on that piece of it, on the written, those writers, I don't worry about it at all. And the kids are going to have fun playing with this stuff, right? It's just a new tool, a new toy to play with. You know, I'm old enough to remember the birth of the internet and public access to that. And that too was going to be the end of the world. And, you know, here we are, right? And phones and smartphones, it's just fun stuff. And then other people can worry about this Terminator stuff. And I don't fully understand why anyone, or War Games, who watched War Games, Matthew Broderick, again, the older among us, you know, don't give the keys to the computer, but other than that, let's have some fun with it.
Yeah. Kirsten, were you raising your hand with that?
I am, because so +1 to what Joe said. If the science organizations, or actually, frankly, all museums, can put on our public trust hats for a moment, right? Because that's a badge. Okay, I just said hat. It's a badge we all have, right? It's something very, very special about museums. It delights and surprises me every time the Pew study comes out that says public trust for museums continues to stay steady, or in some years is increasing. It increased through the pandemic. You see it specifically around science, really strong public trust in when you look at science issues for museums. And so one of the really disruptive things about AI is that it's going to get harder and harder and harder to prove, you know, the disinformation and misinformation that's out there. And I do think we are underprepared, or just flatly unprepared altogether, to address how AI is going to make, or is already making, disinformation and misinformation stronger. We already saw it at the height of the pandemic, and we're going to see it even more. And it is something I would say, as much as yes, already I have colleagues that are using it in our organization to like check our writing, and let's see if there are some other stats we're not considering. And yes, sometimes the stat, when we look it up, it turns out that was completely falsified. But sometimes it turns out that it turns us into like, hey, look, there's a great new stat to use, and making an argument to support our organization. So there are many, many useful aspects of it. But we do have something to beware in terms of the voice that will come from AI and the trusted role that our institutions serve for the public.
Yeah, and what about the effect on staffing? You know, people are worried about losing their job to AI, to robots. You see a problem looming here in your institution? Ashley?
I mean, not today, no. The strength of what we bring certainly within any kind of interactive institution is the staff engagement, the human element where our interpreters, we call them blue coats, engage with each one of our visitors. It's really hard for us to imagine a world where a robot is taking that place. Maybe our kids will grapple with that issue, maybe someday, but right now I have to tell you, our staff is more excited about thinking, back to Kirsten's point, how do we interpret this for our visitors? How do we become the place where our visitors go to learn about AI? Just like we were the place that had the computer, where the computer lab, where people could go and play with a computer and load up Internet Explorer and see what that looked like. And so what does the 2023 version of that look like? And so our staff are much more excited about the prospect of using it as something to engage our visitors with versus being worried about it taking over engagement with our visitors.
Well, thank you for that. Well, I've dominated the conversation with the questions, and we've got a lot of interesting questions in the chat room. And so I'd like to ask that we throw some of those questions at the panel, and everyone feel free to join in on an answer to our participants here. Catherine, can you join us and pose a question from the chat room?
I can. So starting from the top, one of the first questions we received was around how boards are responding to staffing needs and around their supportiveness.
So the question is about boards and how responsive they are to these needs. Is that right?
That's it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, what do you think, those of you who work with a board directly? Joe?
Man, I get all the fun. We get along well with our board. It takes time to establish rapport. You have to sell that group like any group on what is important and make a case for it and show them the truth in the thing you're trying to say is valuable. So as far as supporting staff goes, it's in some ways it's just a budget line like any other at first, but of course it's more than that because it's people. And so you have to kind of help uncover, at our place, staff is 70% of our expenses, staff. We don't pay rent, so that number is a little skewed from folks who might pay rent. It's as high as ever percentage-wise, and it'll be higher than ever dollar-wise this year and even higher again next year by 9%. So, you gotta talk about it and sell it. And of course, in our place, we invite all directors are invited to every board meeting. We have other staff present, one or two staff present at board meetings so that like you all, our places are very complicated in the sense it's hundreds of programs, right? I mean, for anybody who doesn't understand the complexity of our business, Beth, think yours is even 10 times more complex. But, when people come in and they've been selling burgers or whatever they do in their particular domain and then think that this, it's just a science center, children's museum, how hard can it be? So a set of, when you have a couple of staff present their programs and they start to see that the coming to the building is the tip of this big, wonderful iceberg. Anyway, you show them it's important. People are important and people cost money because everyone has to live in this world.
Anybody else want to add to that answer? Okay, let's go to another question, Catherine, in the chat.
Sure. So the next question we have was really around commenting around balancing having to increase salaries to bring in talent and equity throughout the organization with current staff.
Yeah, that's a good question. Anybody want to tackle that? salaries, equity, balancing your budget. Betsy, have you
Well, I
any
think
challenges?
Yeah, I think it's really tough. I mean, we've created salary bands. People have access to salary surveys. So people know what other people in their job classes are making in other places. Not to mention that we are trying to recruit people to come live in Jackson, Mississippi, which is all over the news for bad reasons. So we just have a goal that we're going to try to have our salaries at 75% of the Southeastern average. So, above average, so to speak. And it may mean that we don't have as many people, but the people we have are well paid. And, and yet it's never enough, right? They come, we just had one person approaches yesterday, I need a raise. And it's all personal, and yet it's scientific, and how you navigate between those, sets of data and what a human being needs is just a matter of I think what we all do all day, every day, when we're handling an organism that's really more, well, it's y'all's metaphor, it's not mine, but it's more of a creature than a graph. And so I don't have any silver bullet answers. I think transparency is essential. I think listening is essential, and being competitive and having them know that you're prioritizing their welfare is really important.
Ashley, have you had those challenges as well?
Oh, absolutely. The silver bullet isn't up here. So don't come looking. No, absolutely. And we same answers as my colleagues on this call. Transparency goes a long way. Being very clear that everyone can see in terms of job class where the salary range is sitting, listening as much as possible. One of the things that we did do is create. It doesn't have a very sexy name, but it's called a total compensation document. And so at the end of the year, we share, yes, you had your salary. This is what we paid out in terms of your benefits. This was the professional development that you received. This was the vacation pay. And so it shows, this was your pension contributions, for example. And so it shows the total investment that the organization made in you and made for you and with you across the year. And because we are a government organization, like many of you, we have limitations in terms of base salary and what we can do. And so that's one way that we found to be able to share with our colleagues beyond just your salary. Now, that does come with a challenge, and I would actually be curious if any of my fellow panelists are seeing this trend with the new generation coming into the workforce. We're seeing a big shift away from emphasis on things like pension contributions. It's because of the pressures that they're facing at home. It really is more about salary now and less about an investment sort of into the future. That's to them and what is their reality today. They're not even seeing the future yet. They need to survive now. But our model hasn't caught up to that. And so where 10 years ago we could say, listen, this is what we can offer in terms of base salary, but this is what your pension looks like. This is what your benefits look like. The new generation isn't placing the same type of value in things like pension and benefits. So we've not really caught up to that shift, but it is a trend that we're starting to see and something that we're going to need to pay attention to.
Barry, if I can jump back in and just say one other thing that I'm trying to coach the leadership team to do when they have these conversations with the people who work with them, is really to talk about their career paths very openly and say, for you to go from assistant curator to associate curator, you need more money. Let's talk about your advancement. Let's talk about what new practices you can take on, what new responsibilities that are not just more work, that are things that will enhance your resume, things that will give you more leadership skills. And let's talk about what that is, how that's valued in terms of compensation. So we try to turn the conversation away from the current dollar amount to career trajectory and career path. Sometimes it's limited in our small organization, but to the extent that they understand that we care about their entire future, whether it's with us or in another organization, and how they're positioning themselves to grow towards a more lucrative career, I think they really do kind of get that and they appreciate it.
Kirsten, are you having those same sort of conversations in Cleveland?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think what I say is a look. And my dog has a lot to say on this. I'm sorry. A lot of what let me just pause because I don't want to make it very noisy to say. A lot of what I'd say would be very supportive of what we've just heard.
Thank you. Catherine, let's take another question. And obviously we can't get to everybody's questions or comments in the chat today, but we value them. We're going to keep them, and we will continue to work on our future programming to address your questions, concerns, and your advice in the chat. Catherine, do you have another question?
I do. So one of the last questions to come in was just looking at museums. Are they pivoting to rent their spaces to host different sort of lines of business to bring in additional income?
Well, that's a really interesting question about how do you enhance the revenues so you're able to meet the challenges with salaries and wages. So post-pandemic, are you doing the same things you were doing before? Have you added new lines of revenue, new entrepreneurial activities? Joe, I know you did because you just added a center.
Yeah, right. It's it's funny. It's been a big prom and wedding season. I don't know why, but we've always done rentals and things like that. But man, yeah, for whatever reason, we did like 10 proms this year.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
Yeah,
We've been doing a lot of evening events, from board dinners to bigger parties to even we've even restarted our behind the scenes tours. So we're just like trying to get things going again the way they used to be. We haven't brought back all of our programming, but looking at still what is safe and doable for sure.
We're trying to move from event-based fundraising to some other kinds of earned income that use our skills and our mission. So we have an art and storytelling program that we take into corporate settings where our staff engages small groups of people with works of art and responses to really build their sensitivity to diversity and inclusion through examinations of art.
Ashley, I think you were going to say something.
I've got two small examples that may be practical for others. One was, and they were both COVID innovations that we've kept going with. One was a very modest wedding package. So like 10 people, 1 hour. Initially, we did it to accommodate bookings that we had on our spaces pre-pandemic. And we said, listen, here's what we can offer to cooperate with COVID guidelines. We've kept these little express weddings. They are a dream and a breeze for our team to set up. And we're I think everywhere we're seeing this trend of more modest weddings. And sometimes they're on a Thursday afternoon or like a Tuesday morning. And it's really quite cool. And so that's something that we've kept as an offering. The other, and actually I'm just out of a meeting where we discussed this particular one. During the pandemic, we introduced a different ticket package at one of our attractions that has an extra add-on that we used to include as part of our overall visit. During the pandemic, we created a separate ticket just for that. And it has been gangbusters. We could not have anticipated the appetite for just that one activity. And now that it's coupled with our general admission, it has become an add-on. And people are going for it. So we've actually almost doubled our revenues in terms of admissions at that other site, just with a pricing change, which is something that we probably never would have imagined doing, but the pandemic sort of pushed us toward it. And so generating additional revenue that way by ticketing a little bit differently, something that we were doing as an all-inclusive pre-pandemic. So thinking of different ways of approaching the business model from a revenue perspective has been an interesting trip for everyone, I think.
Yeah, if I could piggyback on that with your other institutions represented by the panelists here, have you had to increase your ticket prices, membership prices? I see heads nodding, but can we expand on that a little bit? How do you go about it?
I'll just chime in. I know that we increased our this is not my area of influence, so I don't have a huge knowledge base for this, but we did increase our membership rates last year, and about a month or two ago, we just increased our gate by $10. So for adults, but it was needed. It's part of our looking at the model for how we're going to recover within the next 5 years. That was a necessary thing that we needed to do. What is surprising is we haven't seen a change in attendance. People are still coming, so which is great for us.
How about you, Kirsten? Did you at Great Lakes adjust prices as well?
We did. And I would say our business model, our strategic business plan going into the pandemic was to really emphasize membership. We have a very strong per cap in what surrounds admission. So we have a very successful parking garage. Our store is very successful. Our giant dome theater has a 30% capture rate. So our focus, and guests were having a very positive experience when they were at the Science Center based on our Coves exit data. So we made a strategic business plan that said, let's keep making a really great guest experience, create exhibits and programs that get people to come back again and again and again, and put all of our emphasis on membership, because when we ran the numbers, we realized we could make more by having that great experience and these multi-layered and ever-changing experiences that got members to come back more frequently and pay for parking, buy things in the store, buy things in the cafe, go to the theater, et cetera, et cetera. And so that really was our business model going into the pandemic. At this phase of the pandemic where we are is finding that people are just spending more money in general. So they're spending more in the store, they're spending more in the cafe. And we know we're not alone in that. We certainly compare our numbers across the Cleveland museums, and we see that per cap of the broader spending in the building being high, not just at Great Lakes Science Center. And so that's really been intriguing, but it made us especially nervous about changing our admission price. So we did a full-on study on that and brought in a consultant and got in some good data on it. And we went ahead and increased, the adult price went up. Membership went up with that. We also, with some of our ancillary experiences, like we have a steamship, we got it up to the same price as the theater so that there was some commonality in pricing. Used all the psychology of, how are you ending the cents on those? And it's only been in place since February, but we were braced for a bit of a dip that would not feel as much like a dip because the price was up. And we've not really found that yet. So we're still watching closely. We're watching our membership levels closely, but we have seen a positive response to raising our ticket price.
Catherine, let's take one more question from the chat.
Sure. Shifting a little bit, there's a question here about how do you best engage team building activities or events for your teams?
Can you say that one more time?
how do you all engage in explicit team building activities or events for your teams?
For the teams.
So
Activity.
Barry, did
Yeah,
you
go
say we
ahead.
have time for one more question?
Yeah,
Could we please take that question that's in the chat about uplifting leaders of color?
okay.
Yeah,
Jen,
you can't follow
sorry
the
who-
chat the way
I'm
we
sorry
can.
who asked that previous question, but we will honor all of your questions and take them to heart. But let's take the one Kirsten found there. Say it again, please, Kirsten.
Yeah, so there's a couple variations on it. Can we address questions about uplifting leaders of color in conjunction, how the museum community can grow the next gen? There's some responses coming in. And there was an earlier question on this, which I'm missing. How do these leaders support leaders of color within their organizations? And I want to specify that this question is intended to go beyond internships and best practices in hiring and recruitment, i.e. the staff you have on hand in your organization. How are you lifting them up? That's the way I'm interpreting that question.
Let's hear from all of you on that one.
Sure.
Kirsten, start.
Yeah, so I will start that it is a, as we're purposely looking at addressing that question, it is everything from checking ourselves on salaries and really, asking ourselves the hard questions and making sure that we don't have someone slipping through the cracks, that we're not intentionally or unintentionally leaving a staff member behind on salary or on responsibilities. We are specifically working with staff of color who, we've pushed to say, how are we going to lift up leaders in development in the organization, and finding like, okay, and again, we talked about our DEI plan has action steps. So we have, specific criteria of like, how are we getting those staff to more leadership development opportunities? Are they, and it's everything from, are they being nominated for awards? Are we getting them on nonprofit committees elsewhere, outside of the organization to develop that kind of growth? Are we sending them to training? Are we sending them to experiences that help? Who are we sending to conferences? Checking ourselves on those sorts of things. So that is where we are at the moment. And I suspect other organizations have great ways that they are working to do that as well.
Ashley, how are you addressing this at your museum?
So one of the angles that maybe I can offer here is for us, we have been doing a lot of work in terms of engaging our Indigenous leaders and our First Nations communities nearby. So truth and reconciliation is a major catalyst in our organization right now. And so in terms of diversity, that we have a major emphasis there, including we engaged some external Indigenous advisors. So we actually have 2 Indigenous advisory committees. We serve quite a large geographic area. So we've got one that represents the eastern part and one that represents the western part, because they are different, and it's important for us to pay attention to that. If there's a lesson that I can share is we approached this past year with the best of intentions in saying we are going to create this full-time Indigenous leadership position within the organization. Aren't we great? We'll find the salary. It will be full-time. It won't be a contract. This is us making a commitment. We found an amazing individual and it bombed. It didn't work. And so step back, first attempt at learning what went wrong here. And we realized that what went wrong is we were approaching the perspective of leadership from a really Western perspective, where we put someone in a position of power and we say, you now make it happen. Figure it out, build your team, hire the people, make it happen. That's not the way it works from an Indigenous perspective. You need a community that then develops a leader, and then that leader leads with the support of the community. And so we flipped the model completely on its head. And instead we started with a really robust and very cool Indigenous internship program. We hired 6 Indigenous interns, fully paid, and they were allowed to work in 4 different areas of the organization during their year with us. So a different area every quarter. At the end of it, I'm very proud to say 4 of them are part of our full-time workforce now. And so they are now bringing in the next layer of Indigenous interns. And so we will develop that leadership pipeline from within. And when the time is right and it presents itself, we will have that more senior position at the table. But it didn't work from a Western perspective to come in and say, okay, hire the leader, now develop your team. And so for us, it was humbling to say this just isn't working because, and this is where I think there's a parallel here, what we were doing was putting all of the responsibility of being that representative on one person. And one Indigenous person doesn't carry the perspectives of the entire community. And so it was really important for us to build that capacity across the organization. And so for us, that was a major learning. So in terms of making sure that we're elevating leadership at all levels from an Indigenous perspective, that's how we approached it. And we're still learning. Truth and reconciliation may be a bit more prevalent here, but the work is just beginning.
And that sounds like the topic for another webinar, a full webinar. So let's think about that. And I'll ask Walter to think about that, but I want to introduce Walter, the founder of Museum Expert, to make a few comments.
Well, I certainly don't want to make comments at this point, and we have the chance to thank everybody later for their participation. If you allow me, my position to ask an additional question, actually, and hopefully someone can answer. From what we have seen over the full webinar, series of webinars that we have over the last 2 years, is that all the things that you have said about rebuilding the workplace are, of course, relevant and important and essential. One thing that I think we have not addressed, and it seems to be a sort of a conflict still, is that people, not necessarily in leading positions, find that there are new skills that are expected in the museum after the pandemic that are not necessarily to do with their traditional expertise. That there is more looking for people from outside with management and business experience rather than people who focus on education and exhibition building and things of that sort. Do you have that experience as well? So is there been a shift in the skills that you are looking for after the pandemic?
Have there been shifts in the skills you're looking for in new hires? Beth? Yes.
Joe on this one. Thank you. I'm thinking about it. I've hired one senior leader on my team since the pandemic, and it's an individual who came to us with the expertise of the field, but also some management experience. So I was fortunate that I was able to find someone who had both of those skill sets to bring to this team and has huge empathy and is really connects well. I think the struggle I'm finding with a lot of the positions that we have, that I have open right now, some of them are entry-level positions, and we want to get people in who want to learn and who want to grow within the organization, but they can't afford to live in Monterey, and there's also no housing in Monterey. So it makes it, there's this, we get back to this dichotomy of, salaries, housing, skills, and it becomes very complicated.
So you mentioned a skill, empathy. Is empathy high on your list for new hires?
Me? Yes. It's huge.
And I'm addressing that to all the panels.
It's also really important for us for our exhibitions, because people can't conserve the world's ocean if they don't connect and have empathy for the animals that live there. So.
And we've hired a community organizer. I mean, she was actually here before COVID, but her networking and skills with grassroots organizations across the community have been really important in building our listening capacities. So we've gone block walking to build audience and things like that. And, you know, art historians and, you know, we don't know those things, but she was very good at is very good at building those capacities to build audience.
And another great topic for another webinar.
For another webinar.
I suppose.
Well, thanks for that. And we are quite out of time right now. So, and Barry, you will have the last word in a second. Just allow me to tell you about our 2 upcoming programs. On July 17th, you can put that in your agenda already. We will have a session with professionals from Ukraine, still working in museums in Ukraine, who will explain how they have to do a job of museum professionals under the circumstances that we know, of course. And the message that I want to share with that is not about describing a crisis situation for what it is, but it's larger than that. It's something that we all can learn about. There was a big article in The Guardian 2 days ago who actually addressed that problem and said, museums show in Ukraine how important they are for people to be able to tell their stories. And so that is something for us too to learn about. So this combination of that war situation and the crisis that we come out about the role that museums play in society is being illustrated by them. And so I hope that we will have some great attendance for that. And we have a conversation with the 2 professionals that are in Kiev and in Lille for discussing that. It's going to be 11 in the morning Eastern time, but that is to accommodate our colleagues that are speaking from Ukraine, of course. And on August the 31st, we will have a similar session like this one, but with European colleagues, because we want to see the situation has been evolving in Europe in a different way. It has all to do with different funding models, of course, between Europe and North America for museums. But we have representatives from Sweden, Austria, Italy, Portugal, the Netherlands, who will comment on similar topics of how they are rebuilding the community within their museum to face the outcomes of the COVID pandemic. So stay tuned for that, and I hope to see you all there. And now, Barry, please, the words.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, I'll end where I started, that we're living in an age of uncertainty, and we've got a lot of challenges in front of us, but we're always going to have challenges in front of us. It's an ever-changing world. And I was reading a book on how to deal with this age of uncertainty just yesterday, and it reminded me of the opening lines of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, and that is, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was an age of wisdom, it was an age of foolishness. I thought that is really applicable to today, our present day, and the situations we find ourselves in daily. But he also wrote that it was the spring of hope. And so I think for all of us dealing in an uncertain world, hope should be out there, not doom and gloom, but hope for the future and taking positive actions to make our dreams come true. So I want to thank all of our panelists today for a great conversation. I thank all the participants for being here and putting your comments in questions in the chat room. And we look forward to seeing you again at another webinar. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.